All right, let's talk about identity formation and purpose in adolescence. So, identity is a huge deal in adolescence. Could be, the primary function of adolescence is to figure out who you are and how you fit into the world. What are you good at and what can you give to the world? Um, but let's just start with a distinction between the difference between self-concept and self-esteem. Self-concept is essentially just understanding what are you like? What am I like? And it increases with complexity during these years of adolescence. Um, what's happening is you're incorporating life beliefs and convictions into your sense of who you are. You're incorporating other people's views of you into your sense of who you are, and you're incorporating contextual differences of who you are in different places. I'm this way with my parents, and I'm this way with my friends, and I'm this way at church, and I'm in this way at work. So there's this sense that you can be all of these things and still be a unified individual, a person. Now that's different than self-esteem, and that becomes increasingly challenging during adolescence. This is the question of, do I like myself? Do I value myself? What am I worth? And is what I am, who I am, my self-concept, accepted and valued by others? That's a big challenge during this time. So, um, let's just continue to look at this. One of the things that I wanted to share with you was in a previous class, we had a brainstorm just on how does someone know that they are valued by others. And, if we were together in a class, we might be doing this ourselves. But I just wanted to share with you what other Chafee students came up with when trying to answer this question. So, you know that you're valued by others when you're treated with empathy and respect, when you're listened to, when you're treated as an equal, when you get time and attention from someone, when you hear words of affirmation, you're doing a good job, when you get nonverbal cues like a pat on the shoulder or a comforting gesture or just your face turned in to look at you. When somebody attends your activities like your sports games or your recitals or your play, or when there are acts of service given to you without you having to ask, "Hey, honey, I did your laundry. I know you're busy this week." Um, when people keep their promises to you, when they don't flake, that makes you feel valid. When someone trusts you, it makes you feel valued as well. Just to be trusted to do something well. And being asked your opinion when somebody wants to know what you think, you feel valued. When they listen to your opinion and value that input, that also feels good, like your value. And when somebody understands your situation with no judgment. So why do I some of these may seem obvious, but it's interesting to me because I think for much of my life it wasn't obvious to me. Like what was it that made me feel valued? And I offer these to you not only so that you can think of them when you work with adolescents or you work with children in general, but especially adolescents, so that but because sometimes you can just go about your day in a busy kind of way and you could forget some of these more subtle ways of making someone feel valued. But I also offer them to you to reflect on yourself, to see how much in my own life am I getting these types of cues that I matter to other people. And if you're not getting enough of these cues, there's a good chance you might be feeling bad. Like you may like so I have a bit of a philosophy that depression is related to not getting enough of this and low self-esteem is related to not getting enough of this. But I also have a different perspective that's maybe not quite rooted it's a little bit more momentary than it is developmental, which is I really think that a person can make changes in their own life so that they can get more of this. So simply by being more available or being more giving yourself or being more interested in other people, then it's that what comes around goes around. So I offer this not only as a way of making other people feel valued in your life, but I propose to you that if you do these things for other people, you will get it back to you and you will then feel that you are valued by others. So that's just a little digression, but not a digression because it's important when thinking about adolescents and how their self-concept and self-esteem is forming, like what is happening on the ground that either gives them that sense of being worth something or not. So Erickson has two stages. The book really talked about identity versus identity confusion, but the other stage that follows right on the heels of this is intimacy versus isolation. And what's happening during this stage is that you're determining what is unique and distinctive about yourself, and you're discovering your strengths and weaknesses during this time. It's a process of narrowing your choices to align with your strengths. Who am I? I am somebody who is creative. So therefore I give my friends greeting cards. I don't know. But you're actually aligning what you do and your behavior with your sense of who you are if everything is going well. There's also a proposed gender difference that Erickson came up with. Remember, he was proposing his ideas in like the 40s. So, this idea that women were different than men was a lot bigger at that time. But he proposed that women put their identity versus isolation stage before, like that identity is much more rooted in relationship for women is what Erickson proposed. Nowadays, I think people are more hesitant to make that gender distinction. Um, and so the reason why I talk about these two things happening somewhat simultaneously is because you're finding yourself and you're also finding who you can be with, right? I don't think these two things are different stages. This is my opinion. Erickson did think they were different stages, but he also sort of swapped them around for men and women. To me, that's an indication that, maybe these two things are going on at the same time. And that as we discover who we are, we also need to discover who loves us, who accepts us, who respects us, who includes us, and who can we be ourselves with. Right? So that's my perspective on Erickson's stages at the adolescent age. Now let's talk a little bit about Marcia's categories of identity development. So we read about this in the textbook, and one thing to understand about these categories is it's basically along two dimensions. One is the commitment dimension, and one is the exploration dimension. So this is essentially as young people are determining what their identity is, and in many ways, Marcia somewhat conflates identity with career and career choices, like who are you going to be for work. And so this idea is that you may be low on commitment and low on exploration, or high on commitment and high on exploration. And if you're low on both commitment and exploration, he calls it identity diffusion. I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do. And if you're high on exploration and commitment, it's identity achievement. It means I've looked around and I found what I want to do. I love children. I know that's important to me. So I'm going to be a social worker. Or I like working with people. I like healing people. I'm going to be a nurse, right? Now, there are two other categories, and one would be high on exploration. I'm just going to go figure out what I'm going to do, but low on commitment. And he called this an identity moratorium. And in many ways, like this sort of overlaps with what we will talk about next week, emerging adulthood and the way that many people may treat a 4-year liberal arts college, where the moratorium is, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to go to college for 4 years, learn about Shakespeare, learn about Keats, and dabble in sociology and psychology, whatever, and maybe take a physics class. So that would be, I'm just going to look around and see what there is, and that's moratorium. The opposite of that is low on exploration and high on commitment. That's identity foreclosure. He says this is when you don't even look around, when you don't even stop to consider. Dad wants me to be a doctor, so I'm going to be a doctor. Or I'm going to be a fireman like my mom. I threw that in there just to mess with gender expectations. But the idea is that people may go about their identity development in different ways, and they may be at a different point. I mean, it would be interesting. Maybe I should do a poll, but it would be interesting for me to find out where you think you are. Some of you are not adolescents or even earlier adults. You may be further on in your life, but I would be interested to know where you are in this, in amongst these categories. Another thing that happens during adolescence is religion and spirituality becomes either, actually, this point here, either more important or less important. There's usually movement for adolescence in this time. So remember what we talked about when we looked at adolescent cognition? There's a lot more questioning going on. There's a lot more deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. There's a lot more sniffing out hypocrisy. There's a lot more pointing out the flaws of an argument. So this may actually impact the way that somebody is in terms of their relationship to religion. Now, um, you know, our book doesn't offer a whole heck of a lot of insight into this process, but we can see how it does happen. In fact, there is a researcher, Fowler is his name, and he proposed that during this time and over the lifespan, there's a movement toward a broad, inclusive view of humanity and religion. Like, he proposed that the development of religion was toward inclusion and a sense of a broadness to one's idea of religion and humanity. That may or may not be the case. I know that a lot of people engage with religion in different ways to serve different purposes. Um, some of it may be in order to know the truth and find certainty, and some of it may be to know the rules so that you can obey the rules and feel good about yourself as someone who is a rule following good person. So this is a very, very complex issue. And really what we can say about it in adolescence is that there are these increasing questions about what the meaning of life is and why I'm on this earth. Like, the questions just happen during this time. And sometimes adolescents find answers in different ways. In some ways, you could see this as a time of vulnerability, like, say, to cult influences. But I don't have a lot of research on that to tell you more about it. It's just something that occurs to me. But one thing I did investigate that I thought was particularly interesting was the role that church youth groups can play in peer socialization. And there is some good evidence that youth groups can be a positive influence on youth. One of the things that I particularly find interesting about youth groups, like, even if you aren't a believer in all of the details about that religion, is that the youth groups tend to put an emphasis on valuing the youth members. So if you think back to a couple slides ago, um, about what does it feel like to be valued, this is one place where um, at least the most people who are involved in it are intentional about helping youth feel valued when they attend these groups. Another thing that's interesting is moral identity. Sometimes, like moral reasoning, and moral cognition, we talked about that as it develops in childhood, in this class. But something that comes up as potentially more predictive than moral thinking is moral identity. Research has shown that people who see themselves as a moral person, as a good person, are more likely to behave in ways that are consistent with that. So this is a bit of a response to and in contrast to Kohlberg's idea about moral reasoning. This moral identity it proposes that instead of, oh, you just think differently about what's good and bad, this is you begin to relate to yourself as a good or bad person who does good or bad things, and then your behavior matches those things. So um so when someone identifies as a moral person, it creates the need for individuals to be true to themselves, to behave in ways that is true to themselves. So that is how it compels moral behavior. And there are a couple different components to moral identity, which is the degree to which these moral concepts like I don't lie, I'm good to others, I don't eat meat, even. That could be a moral identity. That would be the degree to which it is central to who you think you are. That's internalization. And the symbolization is the degree to which you behave in ways, the way you express this in the world. So, and it's an interesting thought. And people who, and it's related in part to this idea of purpose and finding one's purpose. So I'm going to point, you can't really see it here, but the researcher that I have worked with that spends a lot of time on in investigating how youth find purpose in their lives is Kendall Bronk. She teaches at Claremont Graduate University right down the road. And she's very important in the positive youth development research field. Positive youth development, it's sort of a response to G. Stanley Hall saying that adolescence is all storm and stress. And instead, like, actually, there's so much amazing things going on in youth. They're doing great things, they're finding their purpose, and we need to understand this aspect of what happens to youth when everything is going well. So, what is purpose? It's an enduring, personally meaningful commitment to what one hopes to accomplish or work toward in life. So that you really know what you want and you have a long lasting commitment to it. There are three dimensions. One is this goal directedness, like I see what I want and I'm headed toward it. That it's personally meaningful to you. And this moves me to action. And that there's a beyond the self orientation. It's so in this case, like amassing money just to buy a yacht, according to Bronk, doesn't count as a purpose that would fulfill, the definition of purpose. Instead, if you want to amass money to do good in the work and found hospitals and fund budgets, fund medication is what I meant to say, then that might be more of a purpose. And when she has done research on this, she's found that having a purpose helps to foster identity. It predicts grit or resilience or sticking perseverance toward a goal. It's related to hope, and it's related to life satisfaction. Hope is a really important point. We're going to talk more about it. Um, But hope is in many ways an antidote to depression and suicide. So, things as we study in adolescence, everything's a little bit connected to each other. But one of the reasons why I like to emphasize purpose is because it can have such a powerful impact on whether or not somebody has hope at this time of their life. And it's so important. Also, youth with purpose show humility or openness to new ideas, a willingness to assess their strengths and weaknesses accurately. I know we did a lot of reflecting on strengths and weaknesses when you guys took the VIA Strengths Finder test and thought about whether it would make sense for children to be exposed to their strengths and weaknesses. And many of you said no, it wouldn't make sense because they're not ready to actually understand the difference between a strength and weakness, and they may focus on the weakness. And so it becomes interesting then to think about adolescence, that not only are adolescents more ready to do so, but their developmental stage is requiring them to do so. That they have to assess strengths and weaknesses to get through this stage well. If they just accept their weaknesses or only anyway, I'm not going to go on more about that. But also in this humility is understanding the value of others. So this idea of purpose is very powerful for this stage of development. Now, how do you find a purpose? I can't give you too much about that at the moment, but I wanted to give you this idea just in case you've never been exposed to it. And the idea is ikigai. Ikigai. It's Japan. Is it Japanese? Oh, gee, I don't know. But it's basically there are these. This is way more complicated. I couldn't find a simpler one. But you're basically asking yourself as you look for what is your purpose in the world, or even what is the career that you're going to do, is you ask yourself, what do you love to do? And what are you good at doing? Because what you love to do might not be the same as what you're good at doing. You may love to sing, but you may not be that good at it. Or then there's the next question. What can you be paid for? Maybe you love to sing and you're good at it, but maybe nobody's going to pay you to do it. And then the last thing is, what does the world need? So ikigai is the intersection of what I love, what I'm good at, what I can be paid for, and what the world actually needs. And so this, you can see that's a little bit more, there are other little subcategories. For example, if you do what you love and what the world needs, you could say, I'm on a mission. If you do what you love and what you're good at, you could say, I'm exploring my passion. If you do what you're good at and what you're paid for, you could say, great, I have a profession. Or if you do what you can be paid for and what the world needs, you can say, awesome, I have a vocation. But this gives this is interesting to expose people who are beginning with their career to really understand how their choices relate to these 4 important categories, 2 of which are inside you and 2 of which are in the world. And so this is the intersection of what you have to offer and what you love and what the world needs and what it will pay for. Another important aspect of identity is minority identity. And I didn't think that there was much in the textbook about, I thought that there's more to say than what the textbook had to say. So I went and I found this study, testing a model of minority identity achievement and identity affirmation and psychological well-being among ethnic and sexual minority individuals. So they did 3 studies here. And what they were interested in was what can be how exploring the history and contribution, as well as understanding the meaning of a minority identity, can impact the outcomes of an adolescent's life. So here we have, when you've explored the history and the contributions of your group, and you understand the meaning of that minority identity in your life, then it contributes to positive feelings toward the group. You feel about the group that you're good about, the group that you're a part of, and you have a greater sense of group attachment. That's not so bad. And all of that predicts lower anxiety and depression and higher satisfaction with life and self-esteem. So, I thought that it was important to just talk about this because the book talks about, like, different levels of self-esteem amongst minorities, and I wanted to make sure that actually identifying as a minority and understanding it and embracing it, embracing your sense of being a part of that group is good for you. It's good for your mental health, and it makes you happier with your life, according to this research. Another thing to think about with identity, especially in the United States, especially in Southern California, especially in the Inland Empire, is this idea of bicultural identity, like that you're actually a part of different cultures. So then it's more than just a matter of being mixed. Like if you're mixed, like if you take some paint, a bucket of white paint and a bucket of gray black paint and you mix it together, you're going to get gray paint, right? But that's not really what bicultural identity is. It's more like if you got black spot, little bits of black and little bits of white. It's it's not you can't assume that cultures mix or mix well. And these identities can include being raised by parents of one culture into a society with a different culture, and that would be like second generation Americans. Or it can be being raised in a family with two cultures. A parent from, say, Mexico and a father from, say, Punjabi. Um, and, eh, so those multiple cultures, uh, you're being exposed to both of them at the same time, and those cultures aren't always exactly compatible, right? So, the more one of the findings here is that the more different the two cultures seem, the less the individual is able to identify as both at the same time. Now, identifying both at the same time is a predictor of life satisfaction. So then it becomes important to recognize that if you're coming from if you're trying to integrate really different cultures, it's a challenge and it should be identified as a challenge rather than minimized as you should just feel good about that, but rather like to create some space and some room to understand, well, this is difficult and to to give it the appropriate amount of attention and cut the appropriate amount of like slack, or I can't think of the word, generosity towards self in having to face um integrating or being a part of two different cultures as your identity. This is an issue for, say, my stepchildren. Their fathers from India, their mothers from the United States, and they got to be both, but they can't be both at the same time in the same way. So they kind of have to do a lot of switching. Um, and it turns out that my stepdaughter has found her place among other students who are bicultural. She's a huge, she went off to college and just fell in with a lot of other students who have a parent from here and another parent from over there, or they were Germans raised in Peru or something like that. And so she just finds compatibility with other people who also have a bicultural identity. And I think that's awesome. Now let's talk about a little bit relations with parents, because as this identity is forming, let's see what my next slide is. It can lead to parent teen relationships can be kind of hairy. So I just went and I looked for some interesting, what are these memes? I don't know what you call them. But like, here's some quotes. When your children are teenagers, it's important to have a dog so that someone in the house is happy to see you. Um, and then this one, not to brag, but I can make my teen crabby just by saying hello. Tweens are like a box of chocolates. You never know which one of their personalities you're going to get. Going into a teenager's room is like taking a trip to IKEA. You pop in to look and end up leaving with 6 cups, 2 plates, 3 bowls, a tea towel, and some cutlery. And this is when your teen doesn't answer your text messages but posts on Facebook and Instagram. So, and so, okay, I'll just say, when I went to look for these, I saw an awful lot of what looked to me like parent whining, and it can sound like that, like parents whining about the behavior of their teens. But that's just me being invalidating and dismissive of what's actually a real heartfelt, like parents become a little bit brokenhearted when their teens start rejecting them. Oh my god, I could cry right now just even thinking of it, because you're just so shocked that that your little buddy or whoever, like, who just used to come to you and look to you with such respect and hope and eagerness to engage and interact, and they just like reject you. It sort of somehow it seems to happen overnight. But what is happening is that the child is forming identity. They're entering adolescence and they're becoming who they are. And part of becoming who they are is embracing their autonomy and to a certain degree saying, I'm not you, right? So it's kind of hard. And then you end up getting parents whining in this way. But let's talk a little bit about autonomy. It's an important concept. Teens want a sense of independence and control over their lives, period. They want a sense of independence and control over their lives. This is developmentally appropriate, it's necessary. Um, if you're a parent of a young child, if you're lucky and they survive to their teens, you are going to experience this. Parents have difficulty granting autonomy. They have difficulty granting independence and control over their lives. It's one of the hardest things to do in general is to let go of control. To let go of control to your little child who you love more in the world, who you would die before you would see them hurt. To let them rule, go out to this event by themselves, like it's so scary. You don't know if they're going to be able to handle it. Both parents and teens need to move towards seeing each other as unique, different human beings with thoughts and feelings. Okay, so this last point is this is my point for both teens and parents. Because one of the things that we don't often, this is a little bit my insight, and I'm giving it to you. We don't often think of expecting teens to begin to see their parents as adults, but part of as human beings, because what has happened up until this point is your parents are gods. When you're little, your parent is a god. They come down from on high, soothe your pain, and give you food and comfort you. You don't even think of them as a human being. Maybe kids of divorce do, or kids of single parents do. Maybe because uh, but but what tends to happen is children tend to think of their parents as these other, I don't know, they're just not human. But when the child becomes like as tall as the parent or whatever, or starts to say, "Hey, I'm a human being," it then is important for them to see the parent as a human being with thoughts and feelings and needs and concerns. And so this is a really tricky terrain to navigate because parents may not even be used to presenting themselves as human beings. Do it because I say so, right? So I'm not saying that every parent's going to get here, but this is my recommendation. So parents, as you start to say, okay, this my child is now a human being with hopes and fears and desires and pride and shame, all of his own. None of it is my doing now. This is my child's agency is giving my child his or her own experience in life. One of the things that will, as you do that, I'm also challenging you to let your teen know that you're human too. And I'm proposing that that will actually help. There are cultural differences in the sense of obligation toward parents. Here's a chart that identifies that Filipinos value they most strongly agree with the idea that they have a duty to provide assistance, a duty to be respectful, and a duty to support the future of the family. And the lowest agreement with these three statements are among European um, cultural background. I believe these are all Americans, but European background. What's that to say? It's like, yeah, the culture that you and this is interesting because I would put um, my exposure to Indian culture. They definitely value all of these in spades, whereas the European American background, is lower. So, boy, there's a conflict that I witness. Anyway, um, so when we talk about conflicts, we know that there are and will be differences of opinion on appropriate behavior, clothing, chores, curfew, schoolwork, time with friends. So these are relatively minor. These are just sort of the expression of the underlying tension between like autonomy and control, right? And common themes of fights are rooted in the need for autonomy and fairness. So I don't know. I just found it interesting. I went to this mom blog to say, what do you think that are the common themes of teen fights between teens and parents? And these rung very true for me. It's not fair. It's not fair. I don't want to, like he got to go. Why can't I go, etc. And treat me like a grown up. And we're different people. I'm not like you. I don't see it that way. So these are often themes that come up in conflicts between teens and their parents. But lastly, again, I guess for whatever reason, in this particular um, set of slides, I want to offer you my rules of thumb for conflicts between parents and teens. So, so get this agreement. The minute you start to fight, get some of these agreements on the table. Agree to never say never. If you hear yourself saying never, stop. If you hear yourself saying always, stop. Always avoid always. You see how clever I am? Because that's like a really ill-informed way to fight. Nobody always does something and nobody never does something. So prevent your teenager from getting into the habit of using these words when they fight. Stick to the thing at hand, right? Focus on what is happening at that moment and how that's making you feel or them feel. Focus on the feelings, validate the feelings, and then think about what to do about the situation. But the minute you start getting into an always and never, it's going to go badly. Okay? Another thing to remember is that the teenage brain is a thing. They will overreact, but you don't have to. And when in doubt, when there's ever a question like, and the fight's going worse and worse and worse, think about what you can do to respect their autonomy, even if you don't agree with them, even if you think they're completely wrong. Take a moment and find a way to respect their autonomy. If I think about it, I can see why it is you see it that way, right? So if you do those things, my prediction is that your fights will go better. This is